So what does it feel like to be a polymath in the modern world? How does society react to you? How do you manage your time in this fast-paced system? Well, I think it's best to ask an actual polymath to reflect on these questions. And this is why this session we're bringing you someone who's been listed by the Economist's Intelligent Life magazine as one of the top living polymaths. Raymond Tallis is a physician, neuroscientist, poet, novelist, philosopher, and cultural critic. I initially interviewed him for my book, The Polymath, and was fascinated by the interplay of science, philosophy, and culture in his discourse. Watch this, and you'll understand what I mean.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen out there in the dark. It's a very great pleasure to be talking at this very interesting festival on the Polymath. Perhaps as a party pooper, I might be described, I'm going to talk about the myth of the polymath. And I'll spell that out in due course. But let me begin with a famous, perhaps infamous essay on the two cultures, published over half a century ago. It was written by C.P. Snow, who was a novelist, scientist, political advisor, in short, a polymath. He envisaged a populace that was equally well versed in science and the humanities, or if that was too ambitious, a cadre of individuals equally at home in both parts of the cognitive universe. But what would this mean? I don't think we'd really know. Snow, in passing, referred to the fact that he was equally at home with Dostoevsky and quantum mechanics, and he once told a friend that he'd read every major book since the Renaissance. That would seem to set an impossible standard, but it does raise a question of what knowledge and understanding one needs to have to count as being a polymath. How much does one need to know, and indeed why? To answer that, to narrow the question and to make it to seem a little more manageable, I want to ask, what does being well-read as opposed to ill-read require of us? Some years ago, I wrote a piece in which I called for a halt to the endless outpourings of literary critics. The bibliography of books and major essays dealing with Hamlet or Jane Austen novels was enormous. In the case of Goethe's Faust, the bibliography ran to 4 massive volumes. No life would be long enough to read this secondary literature, and it would anyway be in competition for time to set aside for reading the primary literature. So to underpin my case about the limited time available to read the unlimited literary criticism, I imagined an individual who wanted to be adequately versed in the best that had been thought and written. And I quickly came to the conclusion there was a profound mismatch between the time available to familiarize oneself with the key works of Western culture, never mind works outside of this capacity, of this capacious category, and the time available. Just suppose you are a committed reader from the age of 15 to 75. That's 60 years, 22,000 days. Suppose also you spent 8 hours a day sleeping, 8 hours a day working, and 4 hours a day doing your share of the housework, child rearing, and so on, or discharging civic and other duties. And finally, suppose that an average 2 hours a day are spent in socializing with friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, or being occupied in various pastime and leisure activities. This leaves 2 hours a day to be divided between bringing oneself up to date on world affairs, familiarizing oneself with the various sciences, and then catching up on the arts, music, visual arts, and literature in the broadest sense, poetry, fiction, drama, essays, philosophy, and so on. There's therefore perhaps 40 minutes a day for the enjoyment of these arts. But let's give literature a lion's share, say 20 minutes. This makes a lifetime's total of 7,500 hours for literature. Let's suppose we are assiduous, conscientious, even obsessional readers. What proportion of the world's must-reads could we read? Well, there are perhaps 50 significant literatures in the world, British, Polish, Indian, Russian, etc. And I would be surprised if each of those literatures had less than 500 significant writers, novelists, poets, dramatists, philosophers, essayists, historians, and so on. So we are faced with up to 25,000 writers to be read in 7,500 hours. This would allocate less than 20 minutes to each writer. 20 minutes. 20 minutes that would have to include reading, reflecting, and discussing up to, say, 20 significant works of each writer. So we have a total of 500,000 works. So we could devote less than 1 minute to reading and rereading an individual novel, play, collection of poems, or selection of essays. But as you know, an attentive reading of any one of these works would take many hours. Now, I consider myself a fairly rapid reader, and yet my recent reading or rereading of War and Peace occupied the best part of a couple of months. And each of my 3 readings of James Joyce's Ulysses, my favorite book, has taken 3 months. As Joyce himself said, the least I ask of my readers is that they devote their lives to my work. And quite right too. So to say that there is a shortfall in the available time to read would be a massive understatement, even if one merely yomped through books without reflecting on them, discussing them, or investing time in looking at their background and comparing interpretations. At any rate, it puts Snow's claim to have read every great book since the Renaissance very much in question. Let's get another handle on this. The data I've so far given you will have already produced the impression, I have to say the correct impression, that I'm something of a nerd and that my soul is a many-layered anorak. So let me reinforce this impression by sharing a confession. For several years, I kept a record of all the books I read. And I recently looked at this list and realized that the total over a representative 10-year period, leaving aside medical books, was 320. And not all of these were literature in the conventional sense. About half were biographies, history, travel books, and so on. So the annual average of works of literature in the broadest sense for me was 16, making a lifetime's total over 6 decades of reading of under 1,000. Now, allowing for rereadings, and Gide once said that writers wrote to be reread, that would probably reduce my total, lifetime's total, to 500, which is 1 in 1,000 of those books that could be regarded as essential reading for somebody who wants to be well read. What's more, few of them are in play, alive in my mind at any given time. We pass through books, and books pass through us. Not much of them stick, which is why great books are worth visiting and revisiting endlessly. So all of us, even the most avid, purposeful readers, are ignorant of the great part of literature. There's no such condition as that of being well read. There are only degrees of being ill-read. We're less aware of this than we might be, because for every book we actually read, we read about many others, hundreds of others. So we have a sense of having engaged with many books simply through engaging with their titles attached to a review. And this is true even or especially of those who specialize in literature at university. They would have devoted more time to reading what Jacques Lacan has to say about Edgar Allan Poe than to reading Poe's works or critical digests. But they will spend more time on critical digests of post-Renaissance philosophy than reading what Spinoza said. Already it can be seen that being well-read just means less ill-read. And then we have to ask ourselves in what sense the best that has been thought and said is actually present in our mind. How much of our deposit account of knowledge is actually part of the available current account? Most of us are perhaps more aware of our inescapable ignorance of science. The sheer number of disciplines, the technical terminology, the frequent requirement to understand complex symbolic systems, most notably mathematics, the huge number of facts and concepts make it more difficult to deceive oneself. It's not merely those trained in the humanities, but also scientists themselves who are aware that they are ignorant of even the most important observations, findings and laws in most other sciences. Physicists know little of neuroscience, and neuroscientists return the compliment. As a one-time clinical neuroscientist, I am conscious that there are many subdisciplines within that field in which my knowledge is most politely described as patchy. In short, our knowledge of science, seen aright, is a match struck in a darkness of intergalactic dimensions. This is how it is, and this is how it will inevitably remain. The days have long gone when one could even deceive oneself into believing that one was closer to omniscience, knowing everything, than to omniscience, knowing nothing. It was said of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, essayist, philosopher and friend and admirer of William Wordsworth and Sir Humphrey Davy, that he was the last man to know everything. But I suspect even this was an illusion, if only because there were fewer ways in those days that he could be made aware of his ignorance. In short, I think the notion of the polymath is an ideal to which there no longer corresponds any reality. It is, in short, a polymyth. Now, from what I've just said, it's obvious that anything more than a patchy knowledge of a few disciplines is beyond the reach of anyone who has a life of finite duration. It's unreasonable to demand that anyone, never mind everyone, should have a robust, reliable knowledge and understanding of, and perhaps being skilled in, the entire range of arts, humanities, and sciences. The curriculum for such a polymath would not only be incompatible with a life of finite duration, but probably incompatible with being anything other than a person of private means, with no dependence or responsibilities than that of cultivating her own sensibilities and following her own curiosity. So there is no question of having a comprehensive knowledge of or experience of all the sciences or of the best that has been thought and said over the millennia. We can acquaint ourselves only with smatterings. Of course, they should be smatterings of the highest quality. Children whose exposure to Shakespeare is reduced in order to make room for a contemporary who appeals more immediately to their present concerns are being robbed by Philistines, who are determined to make them even or more Philistine than themselves. Be that as it may, at the centre of one's concerns should be to disseminate more widely the special joy and pleasure that the arts afford. In the case of literary arts in particular, this should widen one's sympathies, and to use a familiar but I think accurate phrase, to extend available reality, through giving connected insight into lives, cultures, and ways of thinking other than one's own. Other cultures include other times, and hence the cultivation of an historical sense to offset the presentism and more broadly the here and nowism to which we are all prone, thereby making visible the frame of reference within which we operate. In short, to encourage the adoption of a long view and assume a perspective that enables one to untake the taken for granted and foster a sense of possibility, which must surely be the basis of the kind of awareness we all need to enable us to engage intelligently with society and social affairs. But this doesn't require us to be well read, whatever that may mean, but at least to be widely read and to have engaged with literature that may at first appear difficult and alien, and likewise with science. Being exposed to multiple perspectives will prompt second thoughts, most importantly, a healthy unease regarding the limits of one's own perspectives. But in saying this, I'm not advocating a narrowly instrumental interpretation of the purpose of literature, or indeed of any other art. One thing is certain, an education that doesn't prompt a hunger for more knowledge and more understanding and for lifelong self-education has failed. And to quote what Nietzsche said in praise of Goethe, the nearest any human being would come to be a polymath, and who seemed effortlessly to straddle as many cultures he bumped into. As Nietzsche said of Goethe, we should know only as much of things as we can creatively live up to. That doesn't, of course, mean we should know nothing or next to nothing, but we should always try to imagine what we know and connect it with other things we know, with our lives and their responsibilities. An essential self-educational goal should be to make us constantly aware of the truth about our cognitive limits. When we try to be more intelligent in our interactions with that dense nexus of rumors called the world, we'll always have to live with and within ignorance, though language itself, which enables us to use terms like globalization, society, the world, and the West, often conceals this from us. Having said this, our role as responsible citizens, using our votes and other social powers responsibly, does force us to punch above our weight. To compare, for example, the policies of various parties vis-a-vis aid to developing countries, or reducing poverty in one's own country, or dealing with the credit crunch, or global warming, or a pandemic, to decide which party is superior to another in this respect. It does require us, as it were, trying to be intelligent beyond perhaps our capacities underpinned by solid knowledge. Just some concluding thoughts that I hope will inform our discussion. Polymaths are clearly not people who know everything. There'll always be a huge mismatch between what is known and what any individual could know. So perhaps we need to ask, how much knowledge does one need to be a responsible citizen, to have good judgment, to be able to assess claims that lie outside of one's expertise? And this takes us beyond knowledge to understanding. And there is, of course, a gap between the two, beyond knowing that to knowing how, beyond factual information to competencies, beyond knowing about music to be able to play or read it. It's also necessary to remember that knowledge should not be entirely instrumentalized as merely serving some practical end. Some of you may recall Dr. Watson's astonishment at Sherlock Holmes' ignorance. Holmes's ignorance of things he expected everyone to know. My surprise reached a climax, Watson said, when I found incidentally that Holmes was ignorant of the Copernican theory that the Earth went round the sun. Holmes defended himself by arguing that such knowledge would occupy space that was needed for what he needed to know in his professional capacity. But the solar system, Watson protested. What the deuce is it to me, Holmes interrupted impatiently. If we went round the moon, it would not make a pennyworth of difference to me or my work. The world is complex and has probably got far more complex in the 20 minutes I've been talking, or quarter an hour I've been talking. But if I've increased your sense of your ignorance, then at the very least, I've shared the only wisdom I have, the humble bragging Socratic wisdom of knowing how little we know and how little we shall always know. This Socratic wisdom and some broad principles such as those I've suggested, and a not unrealized ambition to become omniscient polymaths, should inform the debate as to how we should respond to the challenge to break down the cognitive barriers between exponents of different areas of expertise, so that our collective intelligence may be at least the sum of its parts, or perhaps even more than that sum. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so glad I took many notes because you've deconstructed every part of the polymath. So I'm going to have to restart from the beginning. You know, this is classic because you are in my head the perfect polymath. I was about to start the conversation that way because your bio reads as a philosopher, a poet, a novelist, a cultural critic, a retired medical physician, and clinical neuroscientist. I was like, Eureka, I have a polymath I can actually look, up to. I can therefore ask him for all his wisdom and know how I've become one myself. And then here you come and you say, this is a myth. So we are left with now having to deconstruct how we're going to go about this. I think, you have raised a very key point that I think I remember myself as a young girl when I look at the library and I realized I could only read a tenth of it, and that will be it. And I also realized that some of the books I had read 10 years ago, I forgot most of it. So basically the frustration was the fact that you could just really hold on to a few books that you had decided to read. And I remember how heartbroken I was 10 years ago when I realized this. So I think you've kind of put that across on how challenging, and I think 2 hours is already a long time for anyone to be able to do that in, especially if you've got young kids. It's already a stretch for most people, especially in the COVID times when they have their home duties, their work duties, and their family duties as well. So I think thank you for putting that across. I think what I would say, because I think Nietzsche is, for me, is always a bit strong. I think I want to kind of ask whether there isn't a danger of your argument, because we've seen a world over the past year where no knowledge at all is directing to terrible events. It's kind of leading to really bad events. And while you obviously argue, and I've heard you arguing that you're not arguing for no knowledge, I feel that listening to you saying things like this in the context of what's happening for the past year could be dangerous. I think if some of it was not fully kind of understood, because I think everyone is worried that not the right sources are being read, not enough books are being read, and it's already, I think, one of the key challenge that we are having to debate on verifying facts or sources or key information. So it's I hear it, but I find what you're saying just so dangerous in that context. What would you say about the current context?
Oh, well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to clarify, because I wasn't embracing ignorance. That's absolutely for sure. It seems to me one has to know enough to make good judgments outside of one's own area of expertise. And that falls very short of being a polymath, of course. So, for example, one would hope that everybody would have some little understanding of statistics, of what a clinical trial can and cannot show, or what it means to say that a vaccine is 70 to 90% effective, what it means to model a pandemic, even if one cannot do it oneself, to be able to judge the quality of the people who make claims. And you're absolutely right to raise this. I'm so glad you did. There has never been a time when the urgency and the importance of this has been more important. We do need not a brilliantly scientific trained population, but a numerate population, of people who have a sense, can sniff the difference between good science and bad science, who can acknowledge that a paper published in Nature as opposed to a rumor propagated on the internet, there is a serious difference between those two. So thank you so much for the opportunity to clarify that. Yeah.
My pleasure. And I interviewed Andrew Hill earlier, and he was quoting more the idea of being a generalist than a polymath. Would you say therefore that therefore the polymath for you is also outdated because it was the idea of controlling the globe? It's this kind of atlas putting his hands on the globe, or almost Ayn Rand-esque. I will build a book on everything. And that I can sense like how this is limiting or maybe a bit outdated. But isn't that kind of your own definition of polymath? So are you not trying to redefine what your polymath is? And isn't that a form of kind of generalism, which is another way to kind of call it that way?
I suppose it is in a way. I think it was Alexander Dumas said, all general statements are wrong, including this one. And so in many sense, when one was actually questioning some general statements, one is always punching above one's weight because one's producing a meta general statement. But it just seems to me that it is very important, if only narrowly instrumentally, that people do spread outside their own range, that they do, as it were, challenge or face the challenge of understanding an area of expertise other than one's own. It's also the possibility one could have a fantastic conversation. I once gave a talk to 200 professors at a university, and it was almost a pandemic of professors. And basically, I was saying, look, in this university, you have the basis for the most wonderful conversation. You have an expert on Tennyson, and you have an expert on quantum mechanics, and you have somebody else who is a brilliant on political theory, and you never talk to each other. Even worse, the Tennyson expert doesn't talk to the Robert Browning expert. Wouldn't you have the most heavenly, wonderful conversation if you somehow got together and actually shared all your expertise so you could help each other, not to become polymaths, but at least a generalist, as Andrew, I think, said.
Yeah,
and it was interesting. The response was very...
Yeah, and having a deep respect for the other fields, which I think, because if I understand a little bit your very impressive curriculum, because you will put the 2 hours that you've had every day, you put all of us to shame now, because you've obviously been able to pile them with a lot of studies and reading. But I think what was really interesting with you is actually you have done that. There is an understanding that there is a right and left brain, and you have completely challenged that. You have gone from a medical degree to actually kind of reinforcing the role of the arts as well, and kind of defining that. So it almost seems that although you have deconstructed it, I think you're clearly a brain that is trying to have respect for the different sectors, trying to kind of respect for the sector, how they are different to one another and how they should be measured differently as well. Because I remember kind of reading that you said that you didn't want art and music to be reduced to scientific terms, which I love, because I feel that the metrics and the terms have always, I've always tried to put the same ones across, which ends up, I think, to be incredibly limiting. So I can sense that. How did you go from therefore going from a knowledge, and most people will still see as a type of knowledge, sadly, like the stems, and then decide I'm still going to re-challenge myself and go for something that is seen, again, in the current structure as a very different types of knowledge?
It's no great hardship, in a way. I mean, I have a huge gossipy interest in the universe. I want to know what it gets onto and what my fellow citizens get onto. So in that sense, it isn't a sort of, as it were, a job to be done. But actually, as you were talking about the right and left hemisphere, just a quick one, and if anybody out there believes we are our brains and we can understand our different faculties by understanding, as it were, by allocating them to the right and left brain, left hemisphere, we could talk about that. We put in brackets, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I do have a particular concern that when we bring disciplines together, we sometimes subordinate one discipline to another. And a supreme example is neurohumanities. When, for example, there is neuro-aesthetics of music, the idea you can understand music by looking at what happens to people's brains when they're listening to it. And it seems to me that one of the things that's been noticed is when you really enjoy great music, bits of the brain that light up are those that are associated with certain pathways, dopaminergic pathways that are associated with reward. And basically, if that really was any kind of explanation, it would say that listening to the Bach B minor Mass, when you have the ultimate shivers down the spine, it's identical with snorting coke, because that stimulates the same pathways. And indeed, that you could even go as far as saying that essentially the dopaminergic pathways are associated with the pleasure of sex. And people say, oh gosh, so in fact, J.S. Bach really was a sort of Hugh Hefner of the 18th century. Oh, I get it now. But what it means is there is a danger if one, as it were, aims to be a polymath, that you try and subordinate the different disciplines under one dominant discipline. So scientists try to embrace aesthetics, etc., etc. And I think that's a very big mistake. Sorry, that was a long digression.
No, this is perfect, because it's bringing me to have a French socialist question leading to that, which is, don't you think that therefore there's a type of knowledge that economically has a higher value than another? So, i.e., especially through the education system, taking on the metrics, let's say, of the science when you're evaluating something would enable you to have higher funding or higher support, because it is kind of still seen as like the field that is, the one that is the authority. And isn't that where the pressure is going towards? Because I think from the outside, every time we use metrics that are more to do with economics, we can therefore make sure that the impact of the arts is larger and we can have a larger case for it. So isn't that like an underlying economical value of knowledge? That's a certain type of knowledge is of higher value than another. And that's maybe where, therefore, they're not completely equal in the current system.
I'm smiling with pleasure at that question. It's got two dimensions to it. One is, of course, if you're in humanities, by shacking up with scientists, you can often increase your grant income enormously. So if you're doing literary criticism, that's just a few salaries here or there. If you're doing literary criticism with MRI scans, now you're talking hundreds of thousands and so on and so forth. But there's also perhaps behind it the feeling, sometimes people in humanities, that they are not quite pucker in the sense that science is, that they don't have reproducible results, etc., nor do their results have practical consequences in terms of technology and so on. As somebody whose base is in science, I feel that the humanities needn't defend themselves in that way. They are delivering something else. And I do feel it's very important not to be narrowly instrumental about knowledge, particularly in relation to humanities. And one of the interesting things is that within the UK, sorry, yes, far away.
No, please continue, sorry.
But there is something called the Research Excellence Framework, where all the disciplines are required to report on the impact that their specialties have more broadly outside of academe. And sometimes that can be narrowed to things that are purely instrumental. It isn't always, of course, but that's always a worry, because certain disciplines like literary criticism, which I think are fantastic, I've learned more from literary critics than from many other disciplines, it's very difficult to prove that kind of public impact, whereas in the case of research into viruses, the public impact is obvious. So I think it's very important when we think of the multiple disciplines, the multiple mathes, as it were, that we don't value one type of discipline above another. After all, you know, life has to be rich as well as to be survived.
I agree, and yeah, and made bearable. But I think this is a thing, you're actually subconsciously, for me, reinforcing the case of the polymath in terms of its values, because I think it's first and foremost also an equalizer of different subject matters. And I think that's something that you're defending, and that's something that I feel was something that was mind-blowing in the Renaissance times, for at least for me, is suddenly to see people valuing all these subjects on the same level. And yet it kind of changed again, because it seems that it was constantly changing. But that time is kind of remembered strongly as a time where, you know, you would not have a hierarchy, you would have more like a 360 way to value them. So you're still, this is the thing, it's because I studied Nietzsche to a part of it in my old philosophy day. I've learned that anyone who quotes him likes to deconstruct things, but I actually think that you are partially reinforcing the value of the polymath here by wanting to equalize the different subject matters. So I will maintain the fact that you may be more of one that you think you are.
I plead guilty to that charge. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think something that you've brought up in your first keynote is very much a concept of intellectual humility, you spoke to me about, and I think it's very dear to you. Can you expand a little bit on why that's important to you? What do you call intellectual humility?
It's realizing how much you don't know and how provisional what you do know is. It's interesting, the less you know, the more you feel confident you know everything. There's this, everybody knows the metaphor of the widening circle of knowledge. The wider the circle of knowledge, the greater the circumference encounters the darkness beyond it. And there are people one knows who basically have very small minds and very small worlds. And because the two fit over nicely, they know the whole world. They have an answer to absolutely everything, because the size of the minds and the size of the worlds fit nicely. And I suppose it's very important to know how little one does know. I mean, clearly to relish also what one does know. So I think that's the important Socratic message and
I think you spoke about, there's a big difference between, because let's come back a bit to COVID. Obviously, all of us had to, not that I want to come back to COVID, but I think it is still a very critical time that we are all going through.
Very much so.
And I feel it's, you know, there's a difference, as you said last time, between not knowing and what is not known for the future, right? So you are discussing something that it's not knowing, but it is factually there. We should be knowing about it, versus predicting. Because I think for the past year, you know, myself included, as an entrepreneur, you have to make tons of decisions on information that you do not have, but you still have to make decisions. And I will call that the complete unknown. Most of the time, you even don't have a single fact to actually support you in doing that, but yet you still have to act. So I'm expecting that, as you describe this does not partially sustain the idea of predicting anything. This is to the fact that you should be knowing right now.
I think that's right. But there is something called judgment, which is the capacity to make good decisions on the basis of incomplete knowledge. And the judgment is something that's very difficult to define, but you can see it, you know, you can recognize it when you see it. I mean, there were some clinicians when I was a doctor whom I admired enormously. They too were as puzzled about what was going on with the patient as I was, but somehow they were able to live in uncertainty, to make decisions that were actually very good decisions in retrospect, although in prospect it wasn't very clear. And that kind of good judgment that is to say, to make a decision on the basis of partial knowledge, is absolutely something extraordinary. It goes beyond, in a sense, the issue of the polymath.
And what is that? Is that an instinct? Like, how would you define that? How is the brain able to generate that? Because some people, I would say, are more confident with that than others, and I would say that entrepreneurs do the same. They do rely a lot on instinct. They grab the information, but then they lead by instinct. Is that, can we call that an instinct? Is that the same kind of idea of the judgment that you're describing?
If it was an instinct, it's probably equally available to all of us, but it's clearly very unequally distributed. And so in that sense, I don't think it's an instinct. And I tend not to refer to the brain in this context. I think I'm a person rather than a brain. Where the brain fits in, I'm not too sure. All I know is if you chop my head off and my brain disappears, my IQ falls. But beyond that, I'm not entirely sure the extent to which one can, as it were, appeal to the brain to help us understand judgment. Because judgment is such a higher level, higher order thing. But curiously, some people who are polymaths, their judgment can survive becoming polymaths and learning more and so on.
Yeah. That's really, and I think that leads also to one point that you are very strong on from listening to you is on curiosity. How do you go, something that's silly, certain cultures ask better questions than others. The Anglo-Saxons ask a lot of questions of the culture. There are cultures that don't, they would not expect to ask as many questions every 2 seconds like this. It would not be natural. How do you train curiosity? How do you train knowing how to ask the questions, knowing how to get the content, understanding how to kind of, as you said, like having that hunger for it? How does that get trained? How does that get maintained as well? Because I'm sure sometimes curiosity can get lazy and can get no more curious as well. I'm sure there's different stages of life with it.
I think that's true. I mean, one of the trajectories we all go through is we ask lots of questions when we are very young and getting no answers or getting impatient decides, we stop asking the questions. And that's a great shame. But it seems to me that the art of endlessly untaking the taken for granted is something one can cultivate, not in a sort of silly way of sort of questioning everything equally, because that's sort of insincere in a way. But I think if we can continually learn the art of astonishment, the art of amazement, helped by poets, by philosophers, by scientists, and so on, I think that is probably the route, as it were, to be someone who does ask questions. Having said that, when we're cross about something, we're much more likely to see the world in a very straightforward way, aren't we? When you're really cross with someone, you know what you're cross with, you know why you're cross, you know it's right, you should be cross, end of story. So it is very difficult to maintain that counsel of interrogative perfection when one is an angry human being. But in between times, hopefully, one can cultivate the art of being astonished at things.
That's really, really, really interesting because it reminds me a lot of the romantics in art, what you're describing, and the idea of the sublime. I have one of my artists who I'm very lucky to work with is called Matab Hassan, and he said tackling issues of racism that he first wants to open the brain, and he does this with emotion, sensitivity, and aesthetic, so that he can then permeate the brains with idea. Because he thinks that therefore, exactly like you say, you cannot win with anger, you cannot win when you're just straight at someone, but he feels that with aesthetics, with sensitivity, with pathos in that sense, then you can win them and you can slowly open the brain and that will be a better time to be having that conversation. So I feel like it's very reminiscent of anything I have looked at in the 19th century or kind of read from that, of how the aesthetics therefore and the sensitivity. So I'm sure music or dance are the same here, will be opening the brain. Is that what you meant, or am I just completely going offside?
Well, no, not at all. Putting the brain in brackets, of course, the person.
Yeah, sorry. But sorry, I keep on forgetting.
Not at all. No, not at all. I mean, it just seems to be absolutely right, and that you don't go head on, as it were. You approach by indirection, and just as music can influence your feelings without in any way those feelings being argued for. And that's, of course, part of the problem with music, is often being a force for bad. People can be stimulated by marches and so on to do things they wouldn't do otherwise. But you're right, approaching things by indirection is very important rather than head on.
Yeah. No, and I think it's something where I think the role of the arts has been very valuable over the past year, for that matter as well. That leads me back in terms of knowledge, because we've been I'm kind of, to be honest with you, you have published too much to cover anything in 1 hour. So I'm trying to kind of pinpoint the subjects I think are really interesting from the large array of writings that you've actually done. And I think it goes back to, maybe the neuroscientist here is, that you have been, I think is the reason why you're able to cross the two subjects so easily. Because my basic understanding of it is that therefore we use neuroscience for placemaking, for attachment to emotions, as much as we use it for science. Do you think that was the easiest transition from the going into then the arts and musics, or being in the humanist that you've done, to kind of have been a neuroscientist? Has that helped you? Like, was that a nice transition of knowledge here?
Maybe, but as part of it's a reaction against neuroscience. I mean, obviously, as a researcher in neuroscience, I think it's a great, huge cognitive monument to humanity, and its delivered things are extraordinary. But when I was a student at Oxford, I had endless arguments with my infinitely patient tutor. In those days, they had time, about whether neuroscience could explain consciousness, and whether vision could be understood by stimulation of the visual pathways, by light coming in from objects, etc., etc. So in many respects, although I find neuroscience extraordinarily interesting, much of my philosophizing is, in a sense, a critique of neuroscience, of simple scientific explanations of what kinds of creatures we are, and indeed materialist explanations of the fact that we are conscious. I don't think neuroscience delivers that. It delivers many other things. I hope it does, because I spent most of my research in that area. So your diagnosis is sort of half right, and thank you, but there's some extent, there's a slight distance I have from neuroscience, which has certainly fed into my philosophy. Yeah.
I feel that being in your person, therefore not your brain, in your whole body, feels like such an ongoing argument and debate. I hope you can get to bed and rest at times, because it feels like an ongoing argument that it seems to be would never be resolved until the end of times. But obviously that is the way I'm sure you find answers. But I can hear all the inside debates. You've mentioned a phrase when we first talked that I absolutely adored, because I think it's so representative of a lot of the politicians that are guiding us at the minute. You mentioned cognitive crash. You said people sometimes go through a cognitive crash. Can you explain what a cognitive, like, how does one get impacted by this? And am I in fear of being impacted by a cognitive crash? And are there ways that I should make sure that I'm not getting impacted by this?
You know, I don't recall that phrase. I must have been drunk. What was the? Did you say a cognitive crash?
Yes, you mentioned this in light of politicians, and to be fair, I loved this because it really felt like a doomed. And I was like, maybe there are tips and clues he will be able to give me today on making sure it never happens to me personally, and I can basically be immune to it as much as I can.
I think Pfizer are now working on the very product that we all need in that sense. I'm not too sure I have any good recipes there. I mean, coming back to something you were saying a little bit earlier, it seems to me that we only live once. And, being astonished at things and unpeeling one's gaze and not untaking the taken for granted. I mean, those are the things that make life really intellectually worthwhile. There are many other things that make it worthwhile. So, I mean, if I had a recipe for not being a polymath, but as we were having a wide-ranging interest in things, it's not valuing sleep too much. I mean, certainly when I was a doctor, I used to get up at 5 and read or write for 2 hours before going off to the hospital, and that was lovely time because there was still dew on the consciousness, before you set off, and then on the journey to the hospital, you could start switching your mind from Descartes to wondering about Mrs. Jones and the tummy pain, all of which are equally of interest.
It's interesting because you go in a position with a book that's been doing really well on why we should be sleeping more and the effect on the brain for that matter. There is a question that has happened from the audience. So hang on.
Oh, thank you.
Do you think it is possible to be both open-minded and critically minded simultaneously when exploring a particular problem? Which one is more important to cultivate?
I don't think we need to choose between the both. They're both are equally important. And I suspect one has to keep constantly vigilant oneself when either one becomes too open-minded or gullible on the one hand, and too critical or exclusive on the other. And I think one needs to watch oneself very carefully and know that those are two potential intellectual vices that we're always at risk from. So eternal vigilance, I would guess, would be the approach. Yeah.
The eternal debate that is going on in your person as well. So I can now visualize it. So I also have a questions, because that's something I usually ask is, you know, what books would you currently recommend? I think it doesn't have to, I mean, I would love it to be relating to the topic, but I'm also generally very curious to, are they books that you will specifically recommend right now for us to read? I think a list of 3 will be great. Also, it's a selfish interest because I would love to read them. So please, by all means, tell me.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it would be totally arbitrary, wouldn't it, to choose? I mean, amongst the philosophers, although I don't approve of his politics, I found Heidegger's Being and Time one of the most profound books, although I now disagree with it and have even written a book against it. But I still think you have to go through the process of disagreeing with Heidegger amongst the philosophers. Or if you're not choosing Heidegger, then Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, which is an amazing way of basically eavesdropping on a mind endlessly quarreling with itself, which is just an incredible mind, Wittgenstein. So that would be my number 1. Number 2, well, I think there's poetry that really you carry around with you all the time. And I would think that Rilke's Dionysa elegies are just unbelievable. And they're there for all time. And if you don't read German, then I would say The Wasteland. Learn it off by heart and chant it to yourself while you're walking through the dark, and so on and so forth. And then as for fiction, well, I mentioned in my little piece, Ulysses. I do think it is the greatest novel, not of the 20th century, goes beyond that. So James Joyce's Ulysses, and you'll need to read it many, many times before you fully enjoy it. And not only read it, but there is an unabridged CD. It lasts 35 hours, which is brilliantly done. So you listen to the voices as well. So there you are. That's my random choice. If you ask me 5 minutes time, you'd have another random choice.
No, I love it. And I think Ulysses is a good choice because, you know, you almost said in your notes as well on the idea that there comes a point where you can create knowledge. And I think that's very much what's been done with this book, is that creation of knowledge, almost like a little bubble that sustains itself of knowledge as well. And I think that reinforced when you started the talk today on saying sometimes you can take that leap as you've been creating that knowledge and then release it again to the world. And I think that's a very special book for that matter. It's very much like our Proust as well, where you have to read it 10 times and you still have to read it again 10 times. So I think it's also something that will be your eternal debate anyway. So thank you so much for this recommendation. I think, you know, for me,
I can say, damn it. Proust would have been in the first 3 as well, actually, but there you go. Beg your pardon. There's competition for those slots. Yep.
He is. Well, there's also there is the amazing conversations with people who haven't read Proust, I think should be next to having read Proust, because it's so much part of the culture of every country. And I'm sure same with Ulysses, where you could make books about the ones who haven't fully read the book, but talks about the book, and then you could make it a full cultural book as well, which would be really interesting.
Absolutely.
They've really been shaping tons of conversation. So in terms, I have another question, but actually this is another question. This is just to say that how grateful that person is that you have brought the concept of intellectual humility, despite being one of the most knowledgeable person she's obviously listening to, which I would agree with.
Well, thank you.
And I think it's such it is really, I mean, it's exactly, I mean, I think you represent for me, you know, I said this on off before we were starting that conversation. I said, all I was expecting from you is wisdom this evening, because I feel it's been a long week and that's what we wanted to hear. and I feel you are that when, you know, you are sharing this breadth of knowledge, but still kind of highlighting the respect we should have to all the knowledge that we cannot basically obtain, and the humility we should kind of contain within that. And I think you are a really great example of that. And it's still very rare, I would agree. I think we live in a society where you have to shout noise. And I think the PR system is forcing you to also be constantly shouting for the noise you can produce. Because, you know, if you don't look incredibly confident in every single opinion, you may not be reported upon. Your company or anything that you do may not be supported in the same way. So I feel it's not as well encouraged to just be saying, I don't know, or I have this intellectual humility. And if I look at, again, back to kind of COVID, over the management of the crisis of the past year, I feel the best people who have managed the crisis have been the ones who had actually that intellectual humility to be saying at all stages that they didn't know, at all the things that they didn't know. And I think the ones I hold as having failed are the ones who have not been honest in having that intellectual humility. So it's such a special concept to remind everyone, because I think it's a very important concept right now for people to kind of make sure that they go and reach the knowledge that they don't have and have that humility as well.
I think that's true. And if you think about science, I mean, very true. I think about science, it's advanced by embracing and acknowledging uncertainty. This is what I don't know. I don't understand this. I wonder what would happen if we did this. You know, I mean, this is very much what has driven science. If science had begun with certainty, it would end with ignorance. And and as a result of embracing uncertainty, it's left a contrail behind it of pretty solid fact and solid technological achievement and so on. And
yeah, until they are disproven. By a brain like yours will actually disprove most things that they then go on and create. So it's like a continuation. See, that's the scientist side that's speaking. I personally, I feel we've had a lovely roundup, and you know, from the books that you've recommended to kind of having this joy for being curious and this joy for knowledge, and but also this joy of deconstruction. I think it's, you know, debate as well is something that's lacking between all this like authority of people saying, I know X, and arguing for it. And we've had so much arguments over the past year as well, that it's just so nice that you are just having, you could see the joy you're having at deconstructing and debating the old knowledge that you're constantly reading. So for me, it's been a real joy listening to you, and I think it has encouraged me that I can encounter polymaths. I will still count you as one of them, even though you want to disprove that. And I will still look up to you in your 2 hours a day. God knows how you've done that, and use them to make sure I can squeeze as much into it. But yeah, I would love to kind of close a talk on that and encourage everyone to therefore explore all the other talks that are available, because the festival is almost to go on a wrap up. I think we will both agree that Waqas Ahmed has done an incredible job at putting speakers together. And, you know, and I think, again, he is someone like you who's trying to challenge the way things are done and trying to kind of having those open conversations. And from all the conversations I've been lucky enough to attend, I just really felt the kind of sense of celebration of debate, exactly like you're having, and not being scared of kind of rethrowing the debate on the ground, which is silly, but something that we are not used to having anymore. So kudos to him for doing that, and kudos to him for having you here on this discussion. I think it was a real treat to me personally.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure.